Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us to update us on the latest events in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Let's start with the ICJ ruling. I know it's now a few days beyond the interim decisions as they were defined by the International Court of Justice on the case brought by South Africa that Israel is committing genocide. And as we know, that they brought a number of not just charges of genocide, but also some interim calls that they wanted to make. And while South Africa sent a very high delegation, obviously understanding up front that it was a relatively favorable result for them, and Israel sent a very low level delegation, also indicating they understood. At the end of the day, it was characterized mostly, sort of in Israel officialdom as bad, but it could have been a lot worse. And what do they mean by that? Is that the decisions that were made, the interim decisions that were made, some of them, for example, were nothing new. They were basically just a regurgitation of Israel's obligations under the Genocide Act, which is true before the war started, and is true of every single nation on earth. So there was nothing particularly new in there. They did find a plausible possibility that Israel was engaged in some form of genocide. Interestingly, or not, the way that they define genocide, it seemed to me at least, and to many others, the way that the president of the bench basically said that any killing of a group, a nationally ethnic, they kept on using the word ethnically, or religiously defined group, is considered genocide, which is quite remarkable. So then how do you carry on killing, your opponents, your enemies? And basically any war in history would have seemingly fallen under this. For example, in the Second World War, when you killed Germans as you were trying to defeat the Nazis, would that have also been considered genocide? According to some of the interpretations, absolutely yes. So it was quite bizarre on that. They did ask for a report for Israel to show what they were doing to alleviate the humanitarian situation. But the one interim decision Israel was most worried about was the calling of a ceasefire. But thankfully, that did not come. If you want to look at it charitably, you could say that the fact that it was not asked for a ceasefire meant that they did not find, let's just say, too much or overwhelming evidence of genocide, because if they did, they would have ordered an immediate ceasefire. So it's clear that most of the bench, because the decisions were made, all of them either 15-2 or 16-1, let's not forget, as well as the 15-member bench, there was a member from South Africa and a member from Israel, was Aaron Barak, a former Supreme Court president, who actually wrote a very interesting decision himself, and I would recommend anyone who is able to get their hands on it. It really goes through some of the accusations that were made and really brings precedent to show that the rulings, the interim rulings, just didn't stand up in any other case in the past. So it's clear from the interim rulings a number of things. First of all, that Israel again is being treated differently, that they are manipulating, appropriating, editing, changing, shifting the rules specifically for Israel that they did not use in any of the other cases brought before. It is also clear that they could have gone the whole way towards South Africa and ordered immediate ceasefire. This was, as I said, would have been a diplomatic disaster for Israel, which they didn't do. So it means that they do find enough plausibility to move the case forward, because Israel did ask during its opening remarks for the case to be thrown out. very good standards and positions, but obviously that was ignored. But it didn't go all the way and sort of give a very strong hint that it believes Israel is at this point in time or in the future will be engaged in genocide to the extent that they need to be called to halt. So the case will now go to its full extent, and this will go on for years. But basically, Israel is carrying on fighting as normal. Interestingly, in the days after, one of the points that the president of the bench basically said that there were comments that were made by leading Israeli officials, remarkably mentioning Israel's President Herzog, who is considered a dove in Israel. He came out with a statement only a couple of days later saying it was outrageous. His statements have been completely taken out of context and showing all the length and breadth of statements he's made, showing that we shouldn't target civilians, etc. So the ICJ bench could have easily seen the 20, 30, 40, 50 statements made by any of the people that were mentioned in the court case, but they chose very selectively and out of context. But that was the case that they decided to bring forward. So it's clear, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago when we were heading towards the ICJ sort of drama, that there's this concern in Israel where exactly the bench will go. Will it be towards professionalism and it will look at it on its facts and be neutral, or will it move towards a complete politicization where basically countries will fall into their positions where they're allowing the political or the ideological positions to influence their decisions? So I think, again, without being a lawyer or a legal expert, it seems that at this point, our guess is that it's somewhere in between. But obviously, the years ahead will tell us a little bit more. Over the last couple of hours, a new hostage deal seems to really be moving forward. Where this had its genesis is in a meeting in Paris earlier in the week. Qatari, Egyptian, Israeli, American intelligence officials met to try and thrash out some contours that could be agreed on, at least by those four nations, and then hand it to Hamas and say, this is the sort of bare bones of an agreement. We believe you should take it. And once they've agreed on that outline, then more substantive and detailed negotiations will take place. They're still waiting to hear from Hamas. The feeling is that we won't hear from Sinwar for at least a couple of days, as we know Sinwar likes to drag these things on. He likes to play psychological games. But the fact is, Hamas are sending people to Egypt to be involved in the discussion, so they are taking it seriously. It does seem that they are moving back slightly from their position, which is a public position, that they will not agree to any negotiations until there is a permanent halt to the war. Obviously, that's a non-starter for Israel, and it's known very well, but Hamas, it's felt, could be brought to the table because the basic contours are there will be a 6-week pause, a real pause to the fighting, and Israeli soldiers will move out of highly populated areas. The ratio will be something like, for every Israeli hostage, 3 Palestinian hostages will be released, and it will be released in stages, with women, children, and the elderly or infirm will be first, and then I believe it will be women soldiers, and then men of fighting age who are not necessarily soldiers at the time. Maybe they were taken from the Nova festival, and then finally soldiers, and then after that the bodies. What has been most interesting about this is the sort of game of cat and mouse over the last couple of days, because there have been a lot of clearly leaked, floated proposals which have just been outrageously exaggerated. There was ideas put out sort of to every Israeli hostage there'll be 100, 150, maybe even 250 hostages, Palestinian prisoners released, which would basically mean that by the end of this, almost every single Palestinian prisoner in Israeli jails would be released. And that obviously got a lot of rankles in Israel, and we had threats of some of the more right-wing elements by Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who would quit if such an agreement was adhered to by Israel. But this, interestingly enough, did give Israel, it did give, let's say, Prime Minister Netanyahu the ladder to come down and say, it's nothing like that. We're not talking about thousands, and it's not going to be this. It's not going to be a complete halt to the war. So there are a lot of people who thought that these floated proposals were specifically to create a situation of great outrage. So then the leadership could then come back in and say, well, no, we got a much better deal than that. That was not true. So there's a lot of diplomatic wrangling, a lot of games being played, a lot of different interests to be met. There's also talk that perhaps at one stage there could be a deal with Saudi Arabia, normalization. There is the feeling that Hamas, while it won't talk about a permanent ceasefire, they could play it to their people as something that could lead to a permanent ceasefire, because if all of these stages are enacted, it could be weeks, if not months, before Israel is able to return to the fighting. And perhaps by then there'll be intense international pressure for Israel to then stop the war. That is something which is being sold, I believe, by the Qataris to the Hamas as something for them to get on board and able for them to come down their ladder. But we will only have details really when the negotiations really get underway, if and when Hamas ultimately give the green light for the next stages of the negotiations to be underway. Another big story this week is around UNRWA, which is the Palestinian refugee organization. Something that Israel has been warning the international community about for years because of the incitement and because of their attachment and connection to terrorist organizations. Well, this week it was proven at least 12 members of UNRWA, employees, I should say, were involved in the October 7th massacre. There could be more, but Israel has already identified at least 12. Other intelligence information that was released to the Americans and to much of the international community is at least 10% of UNRWA's employees are members of either Hamas or Islamic Jihad, and another 50% have one immediate family member who is a member of one of those terrorist organizations. So the case that Israel has been making that UNRWA is Hamas, Hamas is UNRWA, and there's too much overlap and they work too closely together, Israel has felt that it's been able to get those facts out, and over 12 countries, I think maybe even 13 or 14, have, as a result, have suspended their funding for UNRWA, which has sent them into a bit of a tailspin. They said that they will only now be able to pay their employees, which is one of the biggest employers in the Gaza Strip, till the end of February. But it's something that certainly has become a big story. Just about half an hour ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu put out a press release where he said that UNRWA cannot be part of the day after solution in Gaza, something which is sure to raise a lot of diplomatic concerns. But on the back of these intelligence findings, Israel will certainly be able to make the case a lot better. Another thing that seems to be coming out quite a lot around the world, in the UK and now in the US, is the question of whether the US could unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state at some point in this process. There are some discussions taking place in the State Department amongst certain officials, whether that will be helpful. It is something which hasn't really been countenanced before a negotiated resolution between the parties in the past, but it seems like it's something to be considered, or at least it is going to be thrown out as a threat to Israel if it doesn't move forward in some sort of diplomatic path. Other possible actions the US could take without themselves recognizing a Palestinian state is to remove its veto if the Security Council should decide to go forward and recognize the state of Palestine and inaugurate it as the 193rd or 94th nation in the UN. And perhaps the US can encourage others to recognize it without themselves having to do it. All of these discussions, the hostage deals, etc., are being discussed by Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer with his counterparts in the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and now Secretary of State Blinken. One other interesting development within Israeli society has taken place this week, or has been bubbling for a while, but certainly came out in the open this week. As Israel is releasing more and more reservists, there's only one platoon or unit left in Gaza of reservists. Not they're obviously fighting. There are a lot of soldiers there, but those are people who are part of the army, on a regular basis, either those who are, doing their conscription or those who are part of the army. But there's only one reservist battalion, whatever it is, left. What that means is there's a lot of reservists who have left the front after fighting for over 100 days, and they've become, or at least a certain portion of them, become quite involved in the sort of struggle. Up until this point, the larger social level struggle has been led by the hostages' families, and they've really led the way with the square in Tel Aviv and the events that have taken place, the marches, the demonstrations. Now we see not necessarily an alternative or opposition social movement, but certainly one that's more hawkish and is basically saying we didn't go down to fight to just give up and not achieve our goals. We came to fight. We came to make sure that our people are safe and Hamas is destroyed. That is what you promised us. That is what we tried to do. And now you have to follow through. So there are a lot of different events taking place this week and next week by some of these groups. Some of them have already started trying to block some of the humanitarian aid trucks going through Kerem Shalom. As we know, some of the aid is now going through Israeli territory. And for a while, for at least a couple of days, they were able to stop the overwhelming majority of trucks. Now it's been given the status, that particular area, of a closed military zone. So it's a lot more difficult. And a lot of demonstrators were arrested today, or at least thrown off the area. But what we've seen, I think, is only the first gambit. There is a growing movement, because let's not forget, these are people who've been fighting, who've been prepared to give their life, for this cause. They've seen their comrades being killed or injured around them, and now they hear that at least murmurs or whatever it is, that Israel at one point could stop the fighting before it's achieved its aims, or they're disgusted that humanitarian aid is being let in before hostages get any aid, or even medicines, or even allowed out, or whatever it is. So it's interesting that we're going to see a rise, I believe, in that social movement as more and more reservists come home, get back into some sort of routine. And I think that they will take their fighting spirit, it seems, also to the Israeli social front lines as well. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first one we have is from David Levine asking, the American media finally is recognizing UNRWA's complicity with Hamas's attacks on Israel. Wouldn't this be an opportune time for the Israeli government to hammer away at the issue to inoculate against future harassment of Israel by the United Nations?
Well, I think we have to differentiate UNRWA from other UN institutions. UNRWA has always been seen as problematic. I mean, I'm not going to go into all the details of the fact that, just quickly, that there are two UN refugee agencies in the whole world, one for the Palestinians and one for every other refugee in the world, whereas the one for the Palestinians can hand down the refugee status forever, ad infinitum, for eternity. And eventually, that there's going to be tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of Palestinian refugees. The other refugee agency does not allow people to pass it down, and the budgets are markedly different for every. I think a Palestinian refugee gets 4 to 5 times the amount that any other refugee does. I mean, it's been an extremely unfair process, and it's used as a political weapon. Let's not forget, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, for example, are held in camps, are not allowed to work in many professions, not to marry, they have curfews. The whole Palestinian issue has been a weapon. It's felt by many in Israel, it's been a weapon to beat Israel for many years, and they've held the Palestinian refugees in this frozen state specifically to beat Israel with, and UNRWA has been at the forefront of this. Moreover, over the years, Israel has found that UNRWA, the UNRWA schools, which are many schools throughout the Palestinian areas, have been just as bad as some of the Palestinian curriculums in its incitement and its against Jews, against Israel. So UNRWA is long been seen as problematic for Israel, but now there is a greater understanding. There is talk that maybe, as Prime Minister Netanyahu hinted today, there are other UN organizations, so maybe it can be folded into the overall global refugee organization, the High Committee for Refugees, the UNHCR, or others, but it's clear that, yes, Israeli officials are using this as an opportunity to see if we can get rid of UNRWA once and for all, and perhaps to treat the Palestinian refugees like every other refugees on the face of the earth.
Thank you so much for that. An anonymous attendee asks, is there a concern that Khan Yunis and Rafah could be the next Safra and Shatila of this war? Is there a withdrawal plan in the works if necessary?
Well, what Israel is doing. First of all, it's not in Rafah. Not to say that there are no actions being taken in Rafah, because we know that a lot of Hamas terrorists have now regrouped to there because they think that they will get a certain amount of immunity because it's so close to Egypt, and Egypt has certainly sent signals to Israel that they won't be happy with too much military action in and around the Rafah crossing and that particular area. In Khan Yunis, Israel has already destroyed at least two Hamas brigades, and it's working on defeating the other two. As far as the Sabra Shatila, let's not forget that Israel did not commit Sabra Shatila. That was the Phalange organizations. But Israel, from what it was doing in the north, where it was bombing a lot more, actually the opposite is true. It is far more accurate in its attempts to kill Hamas, because we're putting our soldiers on the front lines. We are losing soldiers because we are not doing what we did in the north. So, will Palestinian civilians continue to die? Unfortunately, that will continue happening because that is war. But Israel is certainly taking extraordinary, and unprecedented steps to make sure that as few civilians will be killed as possible. But Hamas have now moved very much from an open military stance to a guerrilla warfare. They are hiding even more so behind the civilian population. They are disguising themselves. They're disguising their actions. They're using the civilian population. And we've seen in recent days, the civilian population, the Gazan civilian population, are starting to turn their anger against Hamas. We've seen a lot of reports, a lot of videos of Gazan civilians who have actually asked Israeli soldiers to stay, say, don't go until you've killed Hamas. Now, it could be just a handful of people at this point, but it does show that anger is starting to turn against Hamas as they put more and more of their own people at risk.
Thanks so much. Eric would like to know, if there is the 6-week pause, how can Israel stop the Gazan population from returning to North Gaza, and would they want to?
Well, we did see during the first pause that there were attempts by Hamas to send their people north. Obviously, there were some who just wanted to go and see their homes or bury their loved ones, but it was very much in Hamas's interest to try and push them to test Israel's boundaries. And Israel tried as much as possible and was largely successful in ensuring that these areas were not, moved back into, because they're still, conflict zones. I mean, still, even today, Israel believes that it's killed the majority of Hamas terrorists in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, but the fighting continues. There are still pockets, and they think out of about 14,000 Hamas terrorists who were originally in the north, they're down to about 2,000. So the fighting continues, even though it's a largely conquered area, because Hamas terrorists have embedded themselves, they've hidden themselves, and yes, some of them have managed to return under a sort of civilian cover to the north and then resume their hostilities against Israel. So Israel knows that could happen. It's taking these things into consideration. It's certainly not, it's not a deal. It's not an ideal deal. It's something which, at the end of the day, is really just to get the hostages home. So they know that there'll be some very difficult decisions made in the coming days. Again, this is only if Hamas themselves give a green light. If Hamas say no to this deal, then the fighting continues and it's back to the drawing table. But Israel's clearly willing to go a long way, and it understands the ramifications, the repercussions of such a long pause and removing itself. And again, these are just initial details. They could be changed over the days or not even accepted. But apparently the military and intelligence leadership have given the green light to at least the basic principles and outline of this deal.
Thank you. We have a few questions on the hostages here. Amelia Lubitz would like to know, will we ask for proof of life during negotiation? And Len Getz would like to know, have the hostages received the medical equipment they were supposed to receive? And is there any word on the children hostages?
Unfortunately, the answer to all of those is no. There is this belief that Qatar will, at some point, give some confirmation that the medicines that were delivered through them did get to hostages. At the moment, we have not been given that. We're not even sure if Qatar knows. Perhaps that will be a first step, some sort of goodwill. We have not been given proof of life. We don't know out of the 100 and I think 35 people left, about 26 of them have now been declared dead because of various intelligence or medical reasons. They don't go into it so much, but when they're declared dead by the Israel rabbinate, whether it's the military rabbinate or the civilian one, it usually is a high level, not a high level, an extreme level of certainty that these people are dead. So we know that at least a significant portion of the hostages are already dead, and some of those have already, the families have already been told. One policeman who was kidnapped on October 7th, they had not a funeral because they didn't have a body, but they had a ceremony today because they were finally told that the evidence shows that their loved one was dead. So we don't have, that's part of Hamas's psychological aim, and they're not going to give up, what the chips that they have, and that is Israel's uncertainty, and they want to maintain that for as long as possible.
Thank you. Going back to the ICJ case, Denny Renan would like to know, or states, the requirements turn the law on its head. Geneva 4 states that a party may not interfere with humanitarian aid unless it is shown that the aid is going to the opposing party. Now it's incumbent on Israel not only to not interfere, but to aid in supplies. That is contradicting accepted law. Care to comment?
I'm not sure if I understood exactly the question.
Sorry, I don't think
Israel,
this
Israel,
was on ice.
Israel has, I mean, no, my understanding, again, I'm not a legal expert, my understanding of international humanitarian law is Israel has no responsibility to aid its enemy. I mean, if we look at any war in history, we see that you don't aid the enemy. So, and Israel is not occupying this territory, even though some would argue that it still is. But Israel has taken on itself the view that it should try and alleviate the humanitarian situation, partly because of its humanitarian nature, but also partly because they believe that gives them the diplomatic scope to be able to continue fighting. Because if there were great humanitarian disasters, if there was something approaching starvation or whatever it is, then obviously international opinion would pressure Israel a lot more to cease its fighting or to pull back or to do it, more sparingly or whatever it is. So the argument that's being made by the Israeli leadership to the people is this humanitarian aid is needed for us to be able to continue fighting this war. We need to be able to give it in. What happens to it once it's past the border? Well, it seems very clear from not just hostages who are released, not just Palestinian civilians who are taking to social media and recording this, is it's being immediately appropriated by Hamas, and they're taking it for their fighters. And the bit that they have left over, they're selling at exorbitant prices to the people. So it's clear the humanitarian aid, at least in great part, is not getting to the people. It is going to Hamas. So it's a very difficult decision that's being made. But the case, as I said, is being made, or at least that's the attempt, the case that's being made, that it's necessary to continue fighting. But as I said, there's a very large segment of Israeli public. If I remember a poll I saw the other day, even a majority that does not believe that Israel should be giving humanitarian aid while the hostages have not even received medicine. We don't know anything about them, and they're still stuck wherever they're stuck.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We've just about at the end of our webinar here. So, Ashley, thank you so much for taking the time to update us this week.
Thank you very much.
Of course. And to our viewers, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.